I mean, it's almost like talking to a cult survivor because they're using English words. It has a completely different meaning than what any of the rest of us understand.
Hey guys, I'm Hannah Cox with Base Politics, and you're watching my weekly show, Histrionics, where every week we tackle women's issues from a centrist point of view. And guys, I have seen your comments. I have seen them saying that I need to talk to more men, that I need to talk to people who work in the field. And so I have listened. I am more than happy to. And today I have a very special guest. I am so pleased to introduce you guys to my friend, Corbin Payne. He has such a great background on these subjects. I'm going to give you a quick bio. He is the proud son of a U.S. Air Force family, which allowed him to live in 6 states, plus the District of Columbia, before ultimately settling down in East Tennessee. He is an avid reader, writer, and history buff, and he has toured most major Civil War battlefields east of the Mississippi and is now touring them by bicycle, which is really cool. Corbin graduated from the University of Tennessee with a lawyer degree, Juris Doctor, in 2015. After a brief stint in mergers and acquisitions, he turned to trial advocacy in 2016. He initially focused on criminal defense before expanding his practice to include family law, juvenile law, and civil litigation. He has his undergraduate from Liberty University, and he got his legal degree at the University of Tennessee School of Law. So please help me welcome Corbin. Guys, this is one of the people I talk to behind the scenes all the time. He is a wealth of information. He has so much on the ground experience in these conversations. I'm constantly interested in his perspective. I cannot wait for you guys to get to know him and learn more about his work as well. But before I jump into the actual reason you're here today, Corbin, how's it going in East Tennessee? Are you flooded?
Well, no, we got hit pretty hard in Knoxville, but we did not get flooded here for various reasons. But about an hour east of us, it's bad. I mean, bridges have washed out in Greenville, Tennessee, not South Carolina, but Tennessee. We had a small dam that had more water going over the top than Niagara Falls has in a given hour. So we cannot believe it lasted. So I guess strike one for government work. They were due a win at some point, but we've got one now.
Oh, I'm glad that you're okay. I'm definitely
Thank
keeping
you.
an eye on both Tennessee and North Carolina right now and sending lots of prayers. And guys, I'm going to put some links in the show notes. Please do donate. I know that there's a lot of stuff out there. I've got a few people I know personally on the ground there. If you want to send money and resources to help with those efforts, it's definitely needed. So, all right. With all that being said, Corbin asked me to stress to you guys that most of what we're going to talk about today is anecdotal information, but I think that's the best kind of information a lot of the time. You can look at statistics, you can look at polls, you can look at studies, and they, I think, are a tool in forming opinions. But as we well know, they can also be manipulated, they can be skewed, and they don't always give a completely accurate picture of what's going on the ground. And also, they tend to remove a lot of the human aspect to this. And I think, Corbin, you and I have talked, like, I can't stand a lot of the narratives coming out of the red pill community. But I also recognize that a very simple principle repeats, which is that hurt people hurt people. And a lot of the people who are getting sucked into these narratives and these worldviews are hurting. They're not doing very well. And that, as somebody who truly cares about individuals and human liberty, like, it's something that I think we have to concern ourselves with. And you've talked a lot about how you're actually seeing many of these perspectives and worldviews, like, actually seeping into the legal system.
Yes. I really have, and that's been the really wild thing that I've personally witnessed. I'm in my mid-30s. I'm single. I'm a man, so I'm kind of the target audience for this in many ways. And there have been points in time where some of it has been a little bit like has spoken to me a little bit. I've never been convinced, but Hannah, I've literally in the last 2 or 3 years, I've had some of the most bizarre court experiences you could imagine. Nothing law school ever prepared me for, where I literally had men walk in and try to hand me intimate photographs of their partner because, if a woman takes a picture like that, then she's morally unfit to be a wife or to have children in her care. And in every instance that's happened, the man has been in those photos with her. So either they were trying to just sneak that past the court, but in the last few months, when we pointed this out, so the guy didn't even try to cover up that fact. He literally looked the court in the eye and said, "Judge, there's different standards for men versus women. Men are more sexual, women are not. So if a woman is doing this, like that's just beyond the pale." The judge had a facial expression kind of like yours right now, Hannah. Just an older guy, and I mean, he just. I mean, I thought the judge had been punched in the face. So we're seeing stuff like that all the time, and I've even had several instances where husband is trying to argue that his wife or ex-wife is morally unfit because she engaged in premarital sex, and I felt a poke in my shoulder, and my client's going with him. But that doesn't seem to matter. And I want to be clear, by and large, that is not the norm of what you see. Part of why it's so shocking is because it doesn't happen as often. But I've spoken with judges. I've kind of mentioned some of these same stories. Other lawyers have been like, I've seen something like that. Judges are talking about this, and it's there's a couple of judges who are the least online people I've ever met, and they are talking about. I mean, they're using terms like red pill and incel because they're having to see some of the effects of this. So I think broadly the way it's being addressed in some of the things I'm seeing written by other lawyers, by judges, it's just, they talk about it in terms of like narcissism or entitlement from men. But and frankly, I didn't know a whole lot about the red pill community until I started following you, I think her name's Ali Clough, or maybe you're on the name on Twitter. And I went, oh, this is some of what I've been seeing. I'm just hearing this presented to a judge. And most of this has been presented just in complete sincerity. You're not having guys come in and, nodding and winking. They really believe this stuff. And I mean, it's almost like talking to a cult survivor because they're using English words. It has a completely different meaning than what any of the rest of us understand.
That's such a good description because I definitely see like that kind of cult-like mentality that is seeping in where the reason has left the room, the logic's not there. Even when presented with evidence that counters their viewpoints on many things, they cannot let it go. They refuse to, absorb new information. They have lost the capacity to change their beliefs when provided with more evidence. And I think anytime I see that happening, it catches my interest. You and I are both big into history. We know a lot about how these kinds of things tend to go. And so it's a huge red flag to me. It's a huge warning sign. That's one reason I started the show. I think it's very important to push back early when you see these movements starting to gain steam. I was like you, and I've said on the show before, I have always had very healthy, happy relationships with men as a whole. So I was kind of caught off guard by some of this when I saw it really starting to get traction online. And interestingly enough, it was when I started dating Logan, my now husband, who of course, but he had gone through a divorce a few years before we met, and his algorithm on Instagram was feeding him like Pearl and a lot of the red pill content because obviously they had pegged him. They were like, hey, you're a single guy who got divorced, like you're a prime audience for this, right? And thankfully he's not. But he initially started showing it to me, and that was how I first started hearing a lot of these narratives. And, I knew enough about the data to say, hold on, like some of these things aren't adding up, just on their face. When you start digging in, I think a lot of it falls apart quickly. So I want to get into a lot of that with you. I mean, you and I both come from a Christian worldview. I know that's something very important to you. Like, I hate divorce. I think you hate divorce. But at the end of the day, I feel like I try to segment out my religious, personal, and even romantic views when it comes to this topic, because when you're talking about marriage, it's in terms of the court system, you're talking about a government contract. And I think for purposes of keeping the law passion free, you have to be able to really look at this through the lens of how an attorney or a judge or the legal system is approaching it. And can you touch a little bit more on that? Because I think we often forget ultimately that, like, yes, you have your emotions and your feelings around this subject, but then there's also this like very dry mentality and approach that you have to think about it when it comes to the government and the court system.
Yeah. And that's a good, dispassionate or passionless is a great way to describe it. Because when I have walked clients through a divorce and we're standing in front of the judge is asking some just really basic questions like who gets the house, who gets the bank accounts, etc., and just signs a document. And it is probably the biggest letdown ever, especially compared to how a marriage starts with a wedding. But in terms of the law, a marriage is basically like a partnership. And I don't want to be like super unromantic or too passionless here because there are religious definitions, there are personally held beliefs, there's romance, there's all that, and that's all true. But when it comes to the law looks at this as a contract, as a partnership. So they can't really deal too much with the personal relationship side of things. So you're very rarely going to get in there and have a judge shake their finger at somebody for bad behavior, for instance, to an extent. But they're going to be looking at things like how often do kids go with mom versus kids go with dad. And I've exclusively worked in heterosexual marriages, by the way. So that's the language I'm using. And they're looking at things like what's the total value of all the assets that are accrued by the couple during the marriage, and how do we equitably split that up? There are other things that speak into this. It could be a prenuptial agreement. It could be some of the assets came into the marriage exclusively through one spouse versus the other. The question of who gets the kids is always a complicated one, but that's how the law looks at it. It is a partnership. It is generally held. So, and then this is something that you can go in and argue against and convince the judge that doesn't apply here. But generally, it is held that both partners are equally contributing to any marriage. So any assets go to them about 50-50. I know that most judges are I think everybody's going to want to try to put the kids as close to equal with both parents as possible. That's not always possible, though. So that's kind of a longish, rambling answer, but it's hard to just put this into just a simple, easy definition.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things that come up in this conversation, but I guess the thing that I find so interesting is when you hear a lot of these narratives happening, and this is something I hear both men and women saying, actually, so I don't want to say this is just red pill. This is also fourth wave feminism that's pushing this narrative too, but saying essentially you should not get married. There's no benefit for marriage. The law is stacked against people. It does not seem that way for the most part to me. I mean, and first and foremost, I would say, why don't more people get a prenup? Like, to me, I love my husband. I have a romantic attachment to our marriage. I have a religious attachment to marriage, but I also recognize when we got married, like, we are going into a business relationship. I own 2 companies. Like, he is, we're both in our mid to late 30s. Like, we are going to have a prenup. I don't really believe in divorce, but you never know what's going to happen ultimately. You can't control another person. And a lot of these fears that people really seem to harp on about, it's like, you can just actually go ahead and mitigate some of that by having a actual contract that you determine. You wouldn't go into business with somebody, I would think, most of the time, without having contracts and stipulations and asset divisions. And it kind of blows my mind. I mean, from my perspective, how few people seem to approach it that way. Has that been your experience as well?
Yes, I think probably the number one reason people don't get prenups is it just feels unromantic, unsexy, passionless, whatever. You're taking something exciting and then you're having a legal discussion about the practical effects of what this relationship's going to look like. Additionally, a lot of people feel that a prenup is planning for divorce. And you need to have this attitude of divorce will never happen. But I don't want to get too rabbit traily here, but with prenups, very often they also determine what happens with assets upon the death of one spouse. Plenty of marriages get to the, death parts them point. And there are laws in place about who gets to inherit what. So a lot of times you want to set something like that, or you figure something like that out prior to the marriage, prior to doing wills together. So all that gets handled. So I'm a fan of prenups, and I don't think it necessarily is playing for failure.
Right. I think that people just have to, you have to kind of switch. You have to switch between your mentalities. It's like you can enjoy the romantic part and lean into that and have fun, but also you need to do the basics to protect yourself. And it seems like that would really go a long way. But to get back to some of the actual red pill narratives, first and foremost, I want to talk to you about the infamous statistic that over 80% of divorces are initiated by the women. Now, obviously, I have pushed back on that, and I think this is something I'm passionate about. People don't know how to read data. They really have not been taught how to interpret data or to really ascertain its full weight, because, that's a statistic that when you hear it, if you understand how to read data, you obviously say, well, just because they are filing the paperwork does not mean they are initiating the divorce. So anecdotally, as I would suspect, there's a lot more to it than simply who files. I think most divorces, I would say there's two people usually contributing, right? Like it's very probably that one person who's gone rogue and is burning the whole thing down. But, talk to us about that, like what your experiences looked like on the ground on that front.
Yeah. So if we're talking about the initial filers, I would say it's not quite 50-50. I think probably I've seen more women file first than men do, but it's not hugely above 50-50. So the maybe the national trend is 80% of women file first. I don't know. But what I've seen is I don't know, maybe 60-40, 55-45, something like that.
So if women and men are filing about equally, would you also say that they are contributing equally to the divorce? Like, is it typically, I will say this. I do think women are more likely to leave a relationship. That does not surprise me. And that's because I think women as a whole tend to have a higher emotional IQ and are therefore more tuned to problems in the relationship and are less capable, I think, of staying in that kind of discomfort. They're less willing to just be miserable for the foreseeable future and stay in a relationship, whether it be marriage or dating, where they're not getting their needs met. And the second thing I would add is that, I think in my experience and also my research, men do continue to benefit more than women from marriage. I wouldn't say it's like drastically skewed one way or the other, but as a whole, men do tend to get more work around the house. Women still do most of the child rearing work. And so they are getting additional benefits from a relationship that a woman more often than not is not absorbing. So I would say I'm not surprised if women do cause most divorces, but I would say that that's not necessarily causing it, right? If you are in a situation where you are the person doing the bulk of the labor, the bulk of the child rearing, your husband's checked out, what does that actually look like in your experience?
I think the vast majority of divorces where we're at a point where one or both spouses are like, we're done, is serious discontentment. I don't see as much abuse or even adultery. I see mostly just where people have gotten discontent. And I would say that the majority of the time you've got, it's like I was saying earlier, where marriage is basically a partnership. Most marriages fail when one or both of the spouses stop acting like it's a partnership. And the way that I see that usually play out is one partner checks out, the other partner gets resentful about it, and the resentfulness drives more checked out. The checked out drives more resentfulness, and they're done. It's a doom spiral. They don't come out of it. Generally speaking, this is, I'd say about, and I'm being very broad here, about 2/3 of the time, I would say that it was the man who was the one checking out. Usually they're looking around going, man, I work all day and I go home to somebody who wants me to work more around the house or whatever, contribute to taking care of the kids. They're not satisfied with the state or the quality of physical intimacy. So they start looking around going, I think I could do better, or I could be happier. And that may not mean that they're actively pursuing like affairs or something, but I mean, this could be completely 100% in their head, but they're checked out. And you've got the other spouse, again, usually the wife, who's going, we both work all day. He's at, a job. I'm here at the house taking care of the kids, or maybe working herself. And they're both coming home at the end of the day. And she kind of wants to not do all the work herself. And he's thinking that he's worked enough for the day and she can do whatever else needs doing. And it's usually a mess. Hard to recover. It's possible to recover from that. It's hard to.
It seems to be that there's this perception that I find really odd. Like there's this push I'm noticing from the right and from the red pill and trad cons and, these different populations online for women to like go back into being stay-at-home moms. That's a huge push. Women should stay with their kids. But the fact of the matter is, I feel like even when men want women to do those roles, like there's often an undervaluing of how much work that is. I was one of 4. My mom homeschooled us. She did stay home with us. And I think it's why I don't have kids. I looked at that and I was like, catch me never. This is a hard job. This is not what I want to be doing.
Yeah.
I was like, and pass.
Yeah.
But like for people who do opt into that, I think that if we want to see more people choosing those kinds of pathways, then I think 1, they have to be treated as valuable. And then 2, I think there has to be recognition of like, that is a 24-hour job. If you go to work 9 to 5, like, yeah, you do still have to do some stuff when you come home. Her job can't be 24/7 while yours is 9 to 5. That's very unequal. And I can only imagine as a woman getting very fed up in those kinds of circumstances and situations. It's a very parallel world to the one, I've lived and built for myself, but I have a lot of empathy for women who I hear discussing, how life has been like for them in those situations and why they would then be more attracted to the workforce. I've even heard a lot of women saying on TikTok in particular who got divorced, I was already a single parent. This didn't change anything for me. Like I was already operating like a single parent in the marriage. Now I just don't have a man child that I'm having to take care of. And, I find that to be pretty compelling. I think one thing I'm always trying to do is like guard myself against, just hearing one side of the story versus the other. But it's surprising to me, I guess, to hear you say that cheating is not as big of an issue that causes the divorce. And it's really more that kind of dynamic of one partner really not pulling their weight and checking out and then resentment growing. And then that spiral really starting to like speed up. And I think the Gottmans have research on this, which are some psychologists I really like following the work of. It's a married couple that are both psychologists that produce a lot of work around relationships. And they've talked about like 4 horsemen of relationships and like the actual, components that they have noticed tend to be like complete relationship killers. And it's things like stonewalling, it's these sort of innocuous activities think of being what kills a relationship, but seem to have a much larger role actually in the grand scheme of things.
I agree with all of that. And I'll say, if I can tell a quick kind of story to illustrate one of your points. The first time I got involved in a child custody fight, one of the things that we were fighting over was child support. And we came in, we got child support. This guy was making less than $3,000 a month. So is she. And he's being ordered to pay, it's not much. It was like $600 or $700 a month, which for somebody making less than $3,000, that's a lot. For somebody supporting a child and making less than $3,000, that's not a lot. So he came in and decided, I want equal custody. And she looked at me and went, oh, thank God. So we agreed that we would do these week on, week off, which effectively comes out to 50-50. I think we gave her like 183 days out of the year, him 182. And, you split up holidays. But he gets this kid he goes from 2 days a month to 15 or 4 to 15 or something. And he's not having to pay child support, which he's thrilled about. But then he has to start paying for groceries, for clothes, for medical care. He has to get up early in the morning to take her to school. He's got to pay for child care when he can't be home to take care for this child after school. And I've still got this text message saved somewhere where he texts her and he says, "Hey, this didn't save me any money. I'm having to spend almost $2,000 a month on her instead of the $600 or $700 that it was before." And for whatever reason, he could not figure out why we were not willing to go back to the negotiating table on this. I have seen that happen a couple times in my career. And I'll say this as a lifelong bachelor, if I had to sit down and budget out, like, hey, what do I think it costs for for raising a child in this world? I don't know. That's completely over my head and beyond me. I know, and then I know that most women are probably going to handle that within a relationship, especially in the beginning, and guys aren't necessarily going to think this through. But it's a shocking awakening where he's had to basically put 2/3 of his income towards his child, and he's only got her about half time. And he didn't think about that when, she's taking care of this child 29 days out of the month, and he's just got her 2.
Yeah. Well, let's talk more about the child custody thing, because obviously this is one of the more contentious things that gets raised. When I said that I first started paying attention to these issues when I met my now husband, and that's true because also he had gone through the divorce cycle and the custody thing because he has 2 kids. And he had found that here in Georgia, in Gwinnett County, when he was going through that, they did have a preference for the mom keeping the kids. And he had to actually hire an attorney and fight to go get 50-50, which he did. And he fortunately had a pretty, happy, amicable divorce. So she was not, fighting against him. But he ended up getting 50-50 and that's great. But that was sort of shocking to me when I first met him, that it would not just start from a place of 50-50. And from my research, it sounds like that has been slowly changing. It seems like not only have states changed some of their laws and approaches, but also typically these days when men actually seek custody, they are getting it. Is that what you've witnessed? And also, with that being said, do most men seek it? Are most men trying to have a significant amount of custody with their kids?
The state of the law in most states at this point is it does not favor the mother over the father. Now, that said, laws are administered by judges. So there are some counties in Tennessee, I'm sure it's the same in Georgia, where it's the same judge who's been on the bench for decades. They are boomer or older, and they're sitting there going, obviously, guys, kids are going to go to the mom. I don't know why we're having this discussion. But more and more, we are starting from the assumption that something close to 50-50 is ideal. So and again, in most counties, Knox County is one of these, if a dad comes in and they want to fight for something close to 50-50, they're probably going to get it. And unless there's a reason not to. And there's plenty of reasons not to, unfortunately. I get in those fights with some frequency. But I think that the longer time has gone on, and I've been practicing I'm coming up on, it'll be my 9th anniversary a month from now. It is becoming a lot more egalitarian in that sense. Now, to your question about whether men fight for it, in the majority of the cases that I've worked, probably about 2/3, 3/4 of the time, the men are fighting for something greater than about 1/3 custody. And generally, again, unless there's a really good reason not to, generally they get it. And everyone's usually thrilled that dad's going to come in and take responsibility for the kids. And as long as the mom doesn't feel like he's a danger to the kids, or that he's just trying to reduce his child support payment and he's not actually going to exercise co-parenting time, usually a woman who's leaving a marriage through divorce is welcome or is open to dad getting the kids, because that's time where she doesn't have to be on 100%. That's time where she's not having to financially support the kids. So I would say generally, I mean, if you're a good person, like a genuinely good person, no skeletons in the closet, nothing that is going to be painful to talk about in cross-examination, you're going to get pretty close, somewhere over 30%, around 50%, if that's what you're going for.
Yeah, I mean, it seems my anecdotal experience looking out in the world is it seems like more and more men are pushing to get custody, and that when they do, they're given it. And my spidey senses kind of tend to go off when I hear a man claiming like, "Oh, I couldn't get my kids; she's keeping my kids from me." And I not to say that I don't think there's some bitter bio moms out there. For sure there are, but it does seem like the law has adapted a good bit to where, unless there's like a pretty credible claim against you for some reason, it seems pretty difficult to have a scenario where the woman can just like divorce you for no reason, take the kids for no reason, and prevent you from accessing them.
Yes, I would agree with that. As a generality, there are exceptions to everything we're talking about. But yes, I agree with that as in general, that's exactly correct.
So when it comes to child support, like obviously that is something that you hear a lot of men complaining about. And I like that you brought up how it could be a lot of money out of your paycheck and still not be a lot of money to supplement that child. I did an episode on daycare cost a few months ago, and it's very similar, right? Where it's like you look at the amount of money people are having to pay for daycare, and it's astronomical. But then you think, would I take somebody else's kid for 8-9 hours a day for that amount? Heck no. It's not that much money. That would not make it worth it in my book. So it's very similar in that way. I mean, about how much do you see? Is there like an average that most people pay when it comes to child support, or is it sort of all over the map based on income?
So it is absolutely based on income. In Tennessee, there's actually an Excel spreadsheet. You can Google Tennessee child support guidelines, and you can go to the link and you can download the spreadsheet. I actually don't know what the formula is. I'm just used to punching in the information and it spits out an answer. But it looks at the amount of time, the number of days that a parent gets. It's looking at the number of kids there are. It's looking at the income of both parents. And at the end, it kind of spits out a number as to what does the state think is a fair child support payment for the spouse, for one spouse to make to the other spouse. So you will sometimes see one of the spouses try to negotiate in bad faith. So they'll ask for 50-50 and with the intention of never or rarely exercising custody. Or they'll come in and they'll try to hide what their income is. Something you see a lot is guys will quit their pretty good paying jobs, take a $30,000 a year reduction in salary, and not see a change in lifestyle. So you have to assume at that point that they're working underneath the table. So anyway, this formula spits out a number, and it's I don't see a typical child support payment. I just see whatever that number is.
And do you guys, I mean, does this go through you if somebody doesn't pay their child support? How is that something that you come across? I feel like statistically I hear about it a lot, but I'm curious on the ground, like if that's something that.
Yes, and that can trigger a number of things. So if you are owed child support and you're not receiving child support, you can sue them, and that would be a breach of contract. It's also a court violation. Dang it, getting my words mixed up. It's a contempt of court. So when you get a contempt of court, you can catch a fine. You can also catch jail time, and you're going to be ordered to pay it. And in some types of contempt, and this is one of them, you can be held indefinitely until you're not in contempt. So if somebody owes, let's say, oh yes. So if somebody's gets held, I don't know, let's say they're $20,000 behind, they'll get arrested and placed in jail for contempt, and they will have a bond set for I don't know, $5,000, something to kind of make a major payment towards this, and they don't get out until they come up with that money. And it's never ceased to astonish me how very broke people are able, can't rub two pennies together, but all of a sudden they're in jail. They're able to come up with some money. So that's one thing that you could see. You can also see garnishments. People, and frankly, people will get garnished all the time on their wages to pay child support. You can see some asset seizures. So I got a friend, another attorney, who was able to seize a fishing boat because dad was behind. So they got a lien against the fishing boat. He ignored it, and he went out one day to find his fishing boat was gone. So it's stuff like that could happen. But actually, where I see people trying to get around paying child support is where they come in and they try to game that formula. They come in and say, "Judge, I took a $30,000 hit to my income. Okay, and I need to pay less." And in instances like that, a judge can find that somebody's willfully underemployed, which means that the judge says, "I think you can make 80. Just because you're making 50 doesn't mean that I'm going to take money away from your kids. So I'm going to leave child support alone. You can figure out how to find the extra money to pay for this." Often solves the problem. Yes, and if somebody's completely unemployed, at least in Tennessee, there is under statute, I can't remember statute, but under the law, there is. The court can basically act as if you're making a certain amount. It's like $32,000 for women, $35,000 for men, and that's the number they put in for those child support payment calculations. And again, the judge is saying you're an able-bodied human being. You can go out there and you can earn this amount of money. So you have to pay as if you're making that money, and you have to figure out how you're going to earn the money to pay it. Good luck to you. And they're gone.
I like that. I support that, actually.
Yeah.
On the other side of the coin, so alimony gets brought up a lot, right? And this is another thing where I often hear men say, like, women just want to marry you to divorce you so they can take all your money. And I'm sitting here thinking, one, the vast majority of you don't have any money. Americans are in debt. Most households have two people working. There is no money to take, and I don't think most people are having to pay alimony at all, right? And if they do, it's for a pretty short time period.
Yes, I've only seen alimony in about 3 or 4 cases. Again, in my entire career, I'm not an expert on this, and the concept of alimony, like there are entire law school textbooks written about this. But to oversimplify, there are kind of two broad categories of alimony. In one, you will often see like there's either the parties, one of the spouses doesn't want to sell a house or liquidate a business. So there's not as much money to liquidate and pay out both spouses. So instead, the spouse who's holding on to the asset will pay it to the other spouse over time. So think of it almost like a mortgage or a loan payment for the right to keep this marital asset. And then that's always by agreement, and it's structured that way just because it's the easiest way to handle that without a liquidation sale. In the other instance where there's alimony is basically where one of the spouses is at an economic disadvantage. That could be a stay-at-home mom who, has been at home for the last 15, 20 years, didn't have a career. Their college degree or whatever licensure they had is out of date, and they can't just walk out the front door one day and get a job, at least something that would support that spouse in the style that they were accustomed to living. So generally speaking, these types of alimony, either there's a set amount that gets paid, or it's a set amount that's either the payment and the number of payments are set, and it sticks to that. There are very few occasions where long-term or lifelong alimony is imposed on anybody. In my personal life, I know of several instances where that was put in place by agreement, but it was not, had they gone to trial, that would not have been ordered.
So, given that factor, what's really happening in the aftermath of divorce? Who's actually faring better? What does the economic picture look like for people a couple years out?
In the short term, I would say that the women, ex-wives, tend to have it rougher than ex-husbands. I think the emotional weight of this hits them a lot sooner. I think for men, regret tends to, age and expand as time passes. Um, Oftentimes the husband is usually starts off in better economic shape than the woman does. Just again for various reasons. Certainly, if she has children, that's going to get in the way of her ability to build a career. I say get in the way. I probably should say impact her ability to launch a career, especially a little bit later in life.
Mm-hmm.
So over time, though, women tend to do the work, the emotional work of recovering from a divorce. I used to, no matter who my client was, tell them this is traumatic. Even if this is a really smooth divorce, even if y'all don't hate each other, even if y'all end on good terms, this is traumatic. Talk to a therapist. And that is something that I still tell all my clients that. I usually say it once or twice to my female clients. I usually hammer it with my male clients because, I've got a pretty, not a great divorce case right now where my client has a really solid network of girlfriends and sisters and cousins and a really solid mom. She doesn't need therapy. She just needs to talk to one of them on the phone for a little bit every day. She seems to be doing fine. But, men, we tend to think that the way to go through life is with these gaping emotional wounds. So it doesn't get handled. And I often see women take the lessons that they learned from a first failed marriage into a second marriage. With men, not all the time. Plenty of men do the emotional work. Very often, I see men go in and reinvent the wheel on their second marriage. And no, not reinvent the wheel. It's the wrong one to use. They will repeat history, where they will do everything wrong that they did in the first marriage, and they'll be surprised when it fails again, or the same issues arise again. And it's Einstein's definition of insanity. And the majority of the time, their response is, "Women, man, what can you do?" And I've got an answer to that question. They never like that.
Do you find that men or women tend to remarry faster or move on faster? I mean, it seems like, again, this is a statistic versus actual experience, but it seems like women are actually less likely to remarry or move on if they have a husband die even, whereas men do mostly tend to remarry and do it quite quickly. It seems like, I think the average is something like 2 to 3 years. Most divorced men are remarried, I want to say, which seems really fast.
Yeah. So I would say this, I hadn't thought about this, but this is interesting. The majority of the time, when it's the man who's pulling the trigger on the divorce, either he has it in his head that without a wife, he's going to go get to do the swinging bachelor lifestyle and just go play the field. And that, in my experience, especially the older men get, that burns them out after a year or two. So yeah, that'd be about the time they'd be looking to get back into, domesticity again. Probably the majority of the time when the man pulls the trigger, there's someone else. But in 100% of the time, there's something else. He's got some idea that he can be happy or sated or whatever outside of the marriage and something else. Yeah, again, as far as women go, they tend to. I would say the majority of them take a once bitten, twice shy approach to this. So they are again doing the emotional work, and part of the emotional work is figuring out why didn't I see this coming. Um, if you sit there and again go find the average guy. I'm not saying the thoughtful, sensitive guy, but the average guy, and ask, why did your marriage fail? And, he'll sit there and he'll pay lip service. I could have been better about some things, but man, I just walk in the door and it'd be one thing after another. And to them, the reason the marriage failed is because there was some problem with their wife. You ask them, okay, so what are you looking for this next time around to not end up with the same type of woman? And it's crickets. Talk to the average woman about 2 or 3 years post-divorce. Probably not right after, certainly not right after, maybe not for the first couple of years. She'll tell you why it went wrong, and you'll get almost like a doctoral thesis on what killed that marriage. So
Yeah.
and a huge part of that
Congrats.
is yeah. So they're talking about red flags that they missed. And I've got a younger sister who is a single woman living in Virginia, and she talks about some of the best counselors for relationship advice are women slightly older than her, and she's got some good friends that she's gone to for advice in terms of who went through a divorce, and they're sitting there talking about what went wrong. And the ones who didn't go through a divorce are sitting there talking about what went wrong, how they overcame it, and their advice for success. So, yeah, I hadn't. And actually, this is not something I thought about before, but you raise a very good point.
Well, I'm going to throw you another curveball, and this is obviously very much just opinion based, but would you say most divorces should happen? Or do you think that people give up too easily and that, yes, there's problems with the other person. One thing I can say with less than a year of marriage under my belt is marriage is very revealing of your own flaws. Like it's like constantly having a mirror that you are, having to look into and have your worst parts reflected back. And so I think even the best marriages can be very challenging in that way. But, my parents have been married over 40 years. I have a long legacy of long marriages in my family throughout aunts and uncles and cousins and grandparents. And, I accept marriage is hard, and I accept that there are times where you hear stories where you're like, no, that person absolutely had every right to leave and should have left. And, that's valid. But I also feel like our culture has really lost the spine and gumption that is required for two people to consistently show up for each other and just decide to make it work and decide to accept challenges as they come as a way to improve themselves and strengthen their bond. I mean, again, this is totally opinion based, but looking at the number of cases you've dealt with, do you often feel like, man, these people really should be able to work this out?
Yes, I would say the majority. Now, I've got 2 cases right now where pretty severe abuse is present. So I'm not going to look at her and go, just you need to work this out. But I think I said earlier that the leading cause of divorces that I see is discontentment on the part of one or the other of the spouses. I think that the concept that the grass is greener on the other side kills a tremendous number of divorces. And the reality almost never measures up to that. So I think probably the spouse that is doing this the most is the man, who is dreaming about some wonderful future without his current wife, where he's happy, he's sated, and he's got no problems because he's got somebody in his life who's cleaning up after him and sleeping with him. The reality almost never manifests itself. And I think that if most people who are in that position where they're just dealing with discontentment, the marriage can be saved if they're willing to work through that. And, you know, I often get asked what you asked, which is, do women, initiate 80% of the divorces? And again, I don't know the answer to that particular statistic, but what I do see is you get men who they're usually the ones to raise the idea of divorce first, and they're usually the ones that call it quits on the marriage saving steps. So couples counseling, therapy, going on date night more often, whatever that is. And they go, this is just too hard. And, you know, I have had clients, about 2 or 3 clients come in over the course of my practice who have basically said, I can't do this anymore. And I don't moralize to my clients. It doesn't work. No one wants to hear it, but, you know, I will ask there's been several occasions where I've asked these guys questions, and just kind of the end result I'm at, and this is based on their previous answers. The question I've ended with is, are you sure you want to do this? And, you know, they've sat with it and they have said, no, but I feel that I could be happier. It's not that they're not even saying that they're unhappy. They could just be happier. And when I've asked more pressing questions, the source of their unhappiness is not their wife. It's not their kids. It's not their job. It is something internal to them. And because it's internal to them, they have the ability to strike at the root of that unhappiness and kind of work their way through it. And sometimes there are instances where it, you know, the other spouse is doing something, and sometimes you've got to address that too. But sorry, that's a very long-winded way of where I could have just said no.
I mean, I think that's very illuminating.
You're talking to a lawyer.
Yeah, I think it's very illuminating, and it's sad in a way, because I think our culture, to some degree, like, overvalues happiness, right? Like, I think happiness is often a choice, and also happiness is not really like the end all be all goal that you should be chasing in life, and that real deep joy often comes from pushing through unhappy times. And I also think, like, especially among women, I'll say this, and I think probably it's true for men as well, but I know more about women, is there's often this perspective people have that getting married is going to, finding that person, like, it's going to fill this void. You know, your life's going to be complete, and this other person's going to, like, really make you happy, and they're going to be the source of your happiness. And so when that ends up being a fallacy, because it is a fallacy, then people get very demoralized very quickly and are very apt, I think, to give up on relationships and have what you're talking about, this grass is greener mentality. I also think things like social media and the apps have probably exacerbated some of the issues. You know, I often hear from people who got married young, say like, oh, you know, this is when I was single, of course, but like, oh, can I look at your dating app? Can I swipe for you? They're so curious about, like, what's out there, because they didn't go through that. And so they do kind of have this grass is greener mentality. And you're thinking, like, listen, I've been on the apps for years. It sucks. Like, you didn't miss anything. But it's hard to tell somebody that who's been married for 15 years and, you know, got married out of high school or something, long before we had all of this innovation, and before you had a plethora of people that were coming before your eyes, and you're seeing other people's relationships playing out on social media. And, like, I do think that women are susceptible to some of that, and to also falling into that, you know, idea of, like, well, their life looks like this and they're so happy, and so I need to switch out my partner in order to make that happen. And I think that's a really sad thing that happens in our world, that we need, I think, people to be more self-aware around, if anything. You know, I think there's a lot of education that could be done. And unfortunately, a lot of people haven't grown up with healthy, happy marriages to understand what it actually looks like in practice.
And on that point, if I can, you know, positively reference something else I hear you talk about, is the importance of having a broad community. So, you know, I've got happily married friends. I've got friends who are not unhappily married, but they're kind of going through it with their spouse. And then, you know, there's a bunch of single guys. And the result of us being friends with one another and talking collectively and listening to each other is all those married guys know that there is no idyllic world where I'm going out there and just all these model level babes are throwing themselves at me. There's no greener grass in terms of the dating world, because they're sitting there and, you know, they're sitting there going like, man, I feel like I got on the last lifeboat off the Titanic. And I feel that. But I hear about their married experiences, and I think two things. One, I want that. But two, they're not living this Disney utopian happily ever after existence. I'm hearing from them marriage is hard, and I'm hearing from them that it's worth it. So I strongly urge people to have a wide variety of friends, to be friends with married people, to be friends with non-married people, and to be in community like that and do it in person when possible.
Yeah, that's great. And I think especially for men, that's such a really important message. My last episode of Histrionics was actually on male loneliness. And I think that that's something that it's so multifaceted, you know, not just having a support system due to loneliness, but because you do learn from them and you have better mentorship and you have, you know, more guidance, you're better able, or I should say you're more well equipped, I think, to handle life's ups and downs when you have people who've gone through it before you, who are kind of there to help guide you and to give examples of what works and what doesn't. So I really think that is very important for men. And I love seeing men like you who are leaders, not only in the workforce, but in your community. I think you are such a bright, positive light and example of what a man should be. And I just really appreciate your voice and your time today. And
thank you.
Tell people where they can find you if they want to follow you and keep learning more.
I'm on Facebook. I work for the Strong Law law firm. That's STRACHN, and then LAW. So you can find us on our website. I'm also the sous chef on Instagram, X, I guess. So, not Instagram, but X. And it's the punchline to the old joke. What do you call an attorney who can cook a killer meal? So SUE and then chef. And that's the best way to kind of find. Yeah. So
that's excellent. I never knew that was why that would handle.
Yes, that is absolutely the reason. I don't have any kids, but I do have the dad jokes. So,
yeah, you're ready for when the time comes.
Yeah, I'm ready for when the time comes. So, if I ever find somebody who loves bad jokes, I'm set for life. So, yeah, that's where you can find me. But it's great talking to you, Hannah. I really appreciate you bringing me on. And I know this is probably more of a female-oriented audience, show, but I love it. I appreciate hearing a woman of your caliber kind of talk about the ways that men can be better.
Well, thank you, and I hope that it becomes a good space for men and women to both come together, because I think most of them out there are pretty decent people, right? And we're just being drowned out by the fringe Looney Tunes in these online spaces. But I think most men are great, most women are great, and probably could get together and have great relationships. And I really hate to see the poison pill that's being fed to a lot of people. And personally, I think a lot of it's coming from our enemies overseas. You know, I've did a little bit of work on X. I think you probably saw with like the Tenet media funding that was going through allegedly Lauren Chen's company. But you look at her, talking as she started interacting with these, I should say again, allegedly, as she started interacting with these foreign entities that were paying her for her content, starting to say things like repeal the 19th and really, driving these anti-women, anti-marriage sort of red pill trad narratives online. I think there's probably a lot of that going on. And so it's really important to hear from people, normal people. And I think especially on these subjects, it's good for men to hear from other men, men who actually have their acts together, who are leaders. Because I think the fatherless epidemic in this country has had horrible impacts where there is a real void of masculinity and a real lack of examples for a lot of men. And so, it's wonderful to have people like you that are backing women up, that are talking about the realities on the ground, that are impartial, that are truly pro woman and pro men. And yeah, I think it means a lot. And so guys, make sure to follow Corbin. I'm going to drop his handles in the show notes as well. And I will wrap it there. Don't forget, if you like this episode, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Also ring that notification bell so you never miss one of our uploads. And until next week, stay based.